Okay, so I want to geek out a little bit about the Baltimore connection to this case before we actually dive into the first of the two constitutional issues in the case. Um, the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the United States was located where this building now stands. It's a different building now. It's the Customs House. And this is in downtown Baltimore, right by the power plant, the intersection of like Gay Street, North Gay Street, and like Lombard. Um, so yeah, if you're ever out and about downtown near the harbor, near the power plant, and you spot this building, you can remember that constitutional history was made at that place. And oh yeah, so there's one other part of the story that I should have mentioned, and that is not only was the Bank of the United States making way too many loans um, to try and you know grow too many businesses too quickly, which is why they had to like scramble to get more assets and sort of were beating up on the smaller banks in Maryland. Um, Part of the corruption also involves the workers at the bank using bank money to make their own investments, and the bank clerks would keep the profit and return the money that they borrowed back to the bank. And so, as a result, James McCulloch, who had started off as just sort of a middle class son of a Scottish immigrant, was somehow able to make enough money as a bank clerk to buy this huge house. Now, if this looks familiar, this is the like main headquarters of the Community College of Baltimore County out in Catonsville. It's actually really close to UMBC's campus. And so he bought this house, and McCulloch also got a lot of land around it, and it was a slave plantation. And it is very possible. I need to someday just go down to the like historical society and check this out. But because this building is so close to UMBC's campus, it's entirely possible that part of the land that James McCulloch was able to buy by using his sort of corrupt investment practices was where UMBC now stands. So yeah, there's like a very sort of close connection between Baltimore and UMBC in this case. Um, McCulloch also earned enough money through these shady investment practices that he basically paid for the construction of the first Unitarian church in Baltimore City. And this is in the Mount Vernon neighborhood on, I forget, this is Charles Street. Charles and like Saratoga, I want to say, when you're downtown. And then again, like, McCulloch was such a big, like, became, as a result of his making a lot of money, he became a mover and shaker in Maryland politics. He actually became Speaker of the Maryland House of Representatives or House of Delegates at one point, and he was influential enough that he got a street named after him. Again, this is in West Baltimore. So here's Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard as you're heading towards the Howard Street Tunnel. And just before you get there, you come across McCulloch Street, and that is named for James McCulloch, whose name gets butchered into being McCulloch. And then what's interesting is if you go down McCulloch Street away from MLK, and then you turn left on McKetchin, and then right over here on Division Street, 1612 Division Street, is the birthplace of Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first African American to serve on the Supreme Court. And Marshall, interestingly, was also the first Marylander to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court since Roger Taney, the Chief Justice who was responsible for writing the Dred Scott decision. So anyways, you have all this like hidden history, American history, in Baltimore, there are no roads like historic signs that say, "Oh yeah, this road is named after James McCulloch." I don't think there's a plaque outside uh, 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 of um, of the boyhood home of Thurgood Marshall either, which is really a shame. So okay, let's enough of the history. Let's buckle down and start to talk about the issues in this case. So the first issue is: does Congress have the power to charter a bank? And the court answers that question: yes, it does. And so the second issue in the case is: okay, even if Congress does have the power to create a bank, do state governments have the power to tax that bank? And here, Chief Justice Marshall answers this question: no. Okay, so before we start talking about whether Congress has the power to start a bank, there are a couple of. Marshall begins his opinion by sort of reciting some of the facts, and Marshall's such a skilled politician. Just look at the way he sort of like um, describes the background of the Bank of the United States. Okay, so here's one of the quotes you came across early in your reading, where Marshall says the bill for incorporating the Bank of the United States did not steal upon an unsuspecting legislature. What he means is like when Congress was debating whether or not to pass a bill to create the Bank of the United States, um, there was a lot of debate, right? Like it was a huge issue. And you probably already knew this because of the first rap battle in Hamilton, right? Is over whether Congress has the power to create the first version of the Bank of the United States. Um, Marshall says, look, its principle, like what the bank stood for, was completely understood and was opposed with equal zeal and ability. So, like members of Congress gave really good reasons why the bank would be a good idea, and the members of Congress who were opposed to creating it were also offered good and solid reasons. And after a lengthy and smart debate, one side won out. So and then one implication is who ended up getting persuaded was George Washington, right? Like that's why they needed Hamilton needed to convince Washington to lean on Congress to help get this bill passed. And so here we are, decades later. And now it's just now that you think to go to court to ask whether Congress has the power to charter a bank. I mean, George Washington thought Congress had the power to create this bill the first time around. So hey, Maryland, why do you hate George Washington? He signed off on this after a cabinet debate where both sides were represented with the best possible arguments. And then here's another really just sort of great sort of political way to frame the debate here. Marshall observes that the original act, so the first version of the Bank of the United States, was permitted to expire. But a short experience of the embarrassments to which the refusal to revive it exposed the government convinced those who were most prejudiced against the measure of its necessity and induced the passage of the present law. Okay, so the first version of the bank didn't get renewed. It had Congress had said, okay, we're going to create a bank, but the banks is going to close after X number of years unless we decide to keep the bank going beyond that deadline. And the deadline came, the first Bank of the United States shut down, and then things start to go poorly for the government, right? Embarrassments. And so there was an effort to revive it. The effort to revive it was led by someone who originally didn't like the bank, someone who was prejudiced against the measure of its necessity. And who are they talking about? They're talking about James Madison, who, as a younger congressman, said that Congress doesn't have the power to create the bank. But now Madison is president, and he is in favor of the bank. And the reason he changed his mind was because Madison was president during the War of 1812. And if you're gonna fight a war, you need access to cash. And the Bank of the United States provided that. You need someone who's going to be able to go around and collect taxes effectively to raise the money to pay for an army. The Bank of the United States helps that. So James Madison completely changed his mind on this. So you've got George Washington, who supported it from the beginning, James Madison, who came to learn the error of his ways. Why are we still fighting over this? Marshall says, two of these alleged heroes in early American history support the bank. So why can't Maryland get on board too? Okay, so here's the issue. The first issue is, does Congress have the power to create a bank? And the argument that the state of Maryland is relying on is that the federal government's powers are limited. And Marshall acknowledges this, that the government is acknowledged by all to be one of enumerated powers. And if you pay careful attention to what this word enumerated means, it means listed, or actually sort of a numbered list. And so basically the implication here is, if it's not on the list of things that Congress is allowed to do, then Congress can't do it. And the bank is not an enumerated power. So for example, if you hit Control F and searched through the text of the Constitution and looked for the word bank, you won't find it, right? It's not directly listed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Congress can't do it. So here are a couple of arguments that Marshall makes. One of the things he observes is that the federal government isn't forbidden to have implied powers. Implied powers basically mean that, okay, we have a list of things that we can do, but having that list implies that you can do certain things that are necessary to bring into reality one of the things that is on the list, right? And so the Articles of Confederation, which was the United States' first constitution, it was what we had in place from the end of the Revolutionary War until 1787. Did not give the federal government much power at all. Everything was run by the states under the Articles, and it did not go well. And one of the ways that the Articles of Confederation ensured that the federal government never got much power was the Articles of Confederation said up front, we're going to list the powers of the federal government, and we're going to forbid the federal government from taking any implied powers. So the Articles of Confederation, called for sort of a strict construction of Congress's powers in order to ensure that the real power in the country was exercised by the states. But that language, telling people in the Articles, read Congress's powers from a sort of strict construction standpoint, that language, those instructions are not in the U.S. Constitution. In other words, so there's nothing saying you couldn't think of implied powers that are connected to the powers that are listed, but not sort of directly listed, right? And so basically, it's if you can prove that having a national bank is related to some of the things that are on the list of things that Congress can create, then the bank becomes a tool, an implied tool for realizing some of the goals that are listed. So one of the things that Congress can do is regulate commerce, right? Business transactions across state lines. Congress can regulate the value of money and how much money is, out there being traded. And a bank helps regulate commerce, right? By ensuring that certain businesses get loans. The bank can regulate things so that inflation doesn't occur. A bank is, helpful to help conducting a war and raise an army because you got to be able to pay them. And the bank handles all the financial transactions, right? So the bank is really a tool to help powers that are listed in the Constitution become realities.